As with everything else in programming, you can implement a mixin in a variety of different ways. For example, the extend function from the previous lesson is an all or nothing mixin. It takes all of the properties of the source object and copies them to the target object if they don't already exist. You might want that functionality a lot of the time, but other times you want a little bit more control. You want to be able to specify a certain amount of methods that you want to copy from one object to another, in which case you would have to have a different implementation of the extend function. Now we're going to leave the extend function alone in this lesson, and instead we are going to create a new function called mixin. And like the extend function, it's going to allow us to specify a target object and a source object, but it's only going to have one source object, and then we will have a list of methods that we want to copy from the source object to the target object. And I've already created an example for this lesson. It's built upon the concept that I call UI redundancy, because every good UI has some redundancy in it. So I've created a simple little toolbar that has 3 buttons inside of it. Each of these buttons have 2 states. That has an active state and an inactive state. Clicking on these buttons will either activate the button or it will deactivate the button depending upon what state it is in whenever you click on the button. To add some redundancy, I want to have the ability to activate or deactivate the first button in the toolbar by clicking on this link that says toggle active state of item 1. Of course, clicking on this link isn't going to do anything right now because there's no code that binds the 2 parts of the UI together. And we're going to create this so-called relationship by using a mixin. But before we get into that, let's briefly go over some of the HTML as well as the JavaScript code that we are going to use to make this happen. Let's first look at the HTML. The toolbar is made up of a div element with an ID of toolbar, and then the buttons are individual span elements. The link in the document that's supposed to toggle the active state of item 1 has an ID of item state toggle. And then of course we have the references to our 2 script files. Now I'm not going to go over the code inside of toolbar.js, but let's briefly go over some of its API. In order to create a toolbar, you new up toolbar and then pass the ID of the toolbar. This is going to retrieve that element, and then it's going to find any toolbar items inside of this element. And then it will create those objects and put them inside of a collection called items. So if we wanted to access the items of our toolbar, we would use our toolbar object followed by the items property. This is an array where we can specify the index. Of course, 0 is the first item, 1 is the second item, and 2 is the third item. Each of these toolbar items have an enabled property, which you could set to true or false, which will of course enable or disable the item. There's also a property called activated, which is also Boolean. If you set it to true, then the item is active. If not, then it is inactive. And then it has a method called toggle active state. This goes out and it checks the current state of the item. And if it is inactive, then it will activate it. If it's active, then it will inactivate. And this is the method that we are going to use with our link with an ID of item state toggle. Let's go ahead and set up the click event handler for our A element. So I'm going to use the toggle object and then add event listener. We want to listen for the click event, and then the event handler is going to get the target, which is the A element, so e.target, and then we want to call the toggle active state method. And then we want to prevent the default behavior of a link. Now, of course, if we try to run this code right now, we're going to get an error because an A element does not have a method called toggle active state. That is going to be the product of our mixin. So let's go ahead and write that function. Call it mixin. We need a target. We also need a source. And then we need our methods. Now the methods are going to be individual parameters for our mixin. So this is really just going to be a placeholder. We're not going to actually use this parameter inside of the function. We need to loop over our parameters. So I'm going to use a for loop. I'm going to initialize the increment variable with the value of 2. Because that is the index starting with the method's parameter. I'll also get the length of the arguments, and I will set that as the variable LL. The condition is going to be II is less than LL, and then we want to increment II. Inside of this loop, we want to get the method name. So let's create a variable called a method, and we will get the method name with arguments of II. And then we simply want to set target of method equals source of method. Now we need to do a little bit more here, but we'll get to that in a minute. Let's go ahead and call Mixin. We want to pass in our toggle object, which is our A element. And the source that we want to use is toolbar.items with an index of 0. And then we want to copy the toggle active state method. So let's go to the browser and let's see this in action, although we're not actually going to see anything in action. First of all, because we have an error, argument is not defined. So that is on line 11, arguments. Let's go back to the browser. Now clicking on the item does activate and inactivate, but whenever we click on the link, it appears that nothing happens. And the reason is pretty simple. Let's first of all go to our toolbar.js file so we can see the code that is supposed to execute. So here we have the toolbar item data type. We set up the prototype here, but then we also add the toggle active state method. Inside of this method, we are using the this keyword followed by the activated property. Now, in the context of a toolbar item object, this refers to that toolbar item object. But whenever we copied the toggle active state method to the A element, the context of this changed from the toolbar item to the A element. And of course, this activated property is meaningless to an A element. So whenever we copy the toggle active state method, we want to preserve the context of this so that it will refer to the toolbar item object. Well, that's easy enough to fix. Whenever we copy a method, we will simply bind it to the source object. So now if we go back to the browser, we will see that clicking on the link is going to toggle the active state of item 1. We can also do the same thing by adding extra items to the toolbar. For example, the toolbar object has a method called add, and it simply adds a new toolbar item to the toolbar. So if we wanted to, we could add another link to our document, and with our mixin function, we could add the add method from our toolbar to that link as well. There are a lot of possibilities that we could do with this type of a mixin. It gives us a lot of flexibility, and it also decouples our code somewhat. Normally, inside of this click event handler, we would have to reference our toolbar object, get the items property, and then retrieve the appropriate item from our items array. Instead, our event handler is completely unaware of that particular object. And instead, that relationship is made with a mixin. But as with the mixin in the previous lesson, this does have the potential to add confusion to your code. If someone is unfamiliar with this pattern or this style of a mixin, then the potential is there for your code to get messed up during maintenance. So if you do choose to implement this type of mixin, or any mixin for that matter, do be sure to have very good documentation.